Good evening. Tonight, let us step softly into a story woven in winter light. A story that moves at the pace of falling snow, where each breath curls into the air and lingers, and where love does not shout or rush, but instead writes itself. In the quiet, one frost-edged whisper at a time, you may be lying back now, your body finding a comfortable stillness, your breath slowing as the night deepens around you. The world beyond your room fades to a hush, and in this hush, we will wander together into a winter where windows become pages and where words appear not in ink. But in the delicate shimmer of frost, the story you are about to hear is not hurried. It will move like a snowfall, drifting gently, without urgency, settling into your thoughts like soft light. You may drift away before it ends, and that is perfectly fine. The story will hold you, and you can return to it whenever you wish. So now, close your eyes, listen to the slow rhythm of your breath, and let us begin. With a woman named Elin, and the frost that seemed to know her heart. The mornings in Elin's small cottage were always the coldest just before the sun rose. Her little home sat on the edge of a quiet meadow, where winter seemed to arrive earlier than anywhere else and linger a little longer before giving way to spring. On these winter mornings, before the hearth had been stoked and before tea had been brewed, she would walk barefoot across the creaky wooden floor to the front window. It faced east, and the glass was almost always laced with frost-delicate swirls and loops, like the touch of a patient hand painting in silence. Elin had seen frost on windows her whole life, but in these past few months, the patterns had begun to feel different. They weren't just the usual arcs and ferns of ice. Some mornings, the frost curled into shapes that looked like half-written letters or long, winding curves that could have been a part of a word, but never enough to read. She would stand there, fingers resting against the cold glass, her breath clouding the patterns. Some lines reminded her of handwriting she almost recognized, though she couldn't place from where. It was as though the window was speaking in a language she had once known but had forgotten. The days were short in this part of the country. Snow gathered in soft drifts against the fence, and the world beyond her garden seemed to fade to a pale hush. And yet, inside her small home, life was slow and warm firelight at night, wool blankets on the arm of the chair, steam rising from her mug in the mornings. Still, there was a quiet space inside her, something like longing. Not for anything dramatic, but for a warmth she couldn't name. She had friends in the village, a good routine, and days filled with small comforts, yet when she saw those frost patterns, she felt an ache that was soft but steady, as though someone, somewhere, was just beyond the reach of her voice. Each morning she would linger at the window longer than she meant to, tracing shapes with her fingertip, wondering if they were trying to tell her something. And each morning, the frost would melt away with the first touch of sunlight, leaving only the plain glass behind. Outside, a small bird would hop along the fence post, its feathers puffed up against the cold. The trees would creak faintly in the stillness. And Elin would sigh, not out of sadness, but out of the simple mystery of it all. It was on one of these mornings, with the air sharper than usual and the sky holding the pale blue of early frost, that she decided she would start watching the window at night as well to see if she could catch the frost in the act of forming. She didn't yet know it, but that decision would change the shape of her winter. And in the nights to come, the frost would finally finish a word it had been trying to write for a very, very long time. That evening, the air settled into a deeper stillness than usual. The sky had been clear all day, and now, as the last light slipped away, stars began to appear one by one, as if they too were pausing to listen to the hush of the night. Elin lit only a single lamp, its golden glow spilling across the wooden table. She moved quietly, her every action softened by the sense that she was waiting for something, though she couldn't quite name what. The kettle whispered on the stove, sending slow curls of steam into the room. She poured the hot water over loose tea leaves, watching them swirl and unfold in the deep mug. Then, mug in hand, she walked to her chair by the front window and pulled the wool blanket over her lap. The meadow beyond the glass was silvered under. The moonlight snow lay in soft waves across the ground, each drift catching just a touch of the pale glow from above. A lone fox crossed the open space, its paws pressing silent impressions into the snow before disappearing into the trees. She rested her hand against the window pane. It was cold, but not yet touched by frost. She imagined the glass like a blank sheet of paper and wondered what the night might choose to write on it. Hours passed, marked only by the faint ticking of the old clock and the occasional pop from the cooling stove. She read a little, dozed a little, and let her thoughts wander like small snowflakes drifting without direction. Near midnight, she noticed the first signs, thin threads of ice beginning to stretch across the corner of the glass, branching like the veins of a leaf. She leaned closer, breath slow and careful, watching as the frost slowly grew, its white fingers reaching outwards in delicate silence. And then, something shifted. The familiar curls and loops began to align. One thin arc curved perfectly in two. Another, forming a shape she had never seen in frost before. A letter, a clear, deliberate letter. She blinked, thinking perhaps her sleepy mind was imagining it, but then another letter formed beside it, and then another, slow, steady, deliberate, until the frost spelled a single word, a name, not hers, not anyone she knew. But as soon as she saw it, something deep inside her stirred, as if she had heard that name in a dream long ago. She whispered it aloud, the sound soft in the quiet of the room. The name seemed to linger in the air, like the fading trace of a breath on glass. Outside, a flake of snow drifted past, catching the moonlight before vanishing into the darkness. Elin leaned back in her chair, the name echoing gently in her thoughts, over and over, until the edges of sleep began to gather around her. Somewhere beyond the meadow, beyond the reach of her window, another person stirred in the night, someone who had just seen her name appear in frost on their own glass. The following day passed like a slow-moving river, each moment gentle and unhurried, yet carrying her steadily towards something unseen. Elin kept thinking of the name she had read, in frost. She rolled it silently in her mind, feeling the way it seemed to fit on her tongue as though it belonged there, though she could not recall ever speaking it before. B while 8 afternoon, the sky had deepened into the muted silver of approaching snow. The air outside was still, the kind of stillness that feels full, as though it is holding its breath before letting the first flakes fall. She dressed warmly, wool scarf, thick coat, boots laced tight, and stepped outside. Her breath rose in small clouds before her, and each step left a soft mark in the untouched snow that covered the path toward the meadow. The world was hushed, so quiet that the only sound was the faint crunch of snow beneath her feet as she crossed toward the fence. Her eyes caught movement in the distance. There on the far side of the field, by the edge where the trees began, stood a figure. He was still, watching her just as she watched him. The space between them was filled with falling snow, flakes drifting slowly, each one turning in the dim light before touching the ground. Elin didn't move closer at first. Something about the moment felt as delicate as the frost on her window, and she didn't want to break it. Instead, she lifted a gloved hand in a quiet greeting. The man returned the gesture, his movements slow and unhurried, as though they had all the time in the world. Then he did something strange, something that made her breath catch. He raised his bare hand toward the air, and as he exhaled, his breath clouded white in the cold. But it didn't drift away. It clung there for a moment, shaping itself, just as frost had shaped words on her window. She watched, hardly blinking, as the vapor curled into letters, and those letters formed her name. The sight made her chest take in the gentlest way. Her name, written not in ink, not in frost, but in the warmth of a breath meeting the winter air. She didn't know how to answer in kind, but she felt something pulling her forward. So she walked slowly, step by step, until she was close enough to see his face. He had eyes the color of quiet water in early spring, soft and steady. Snow rested lightly on his dark hair, and when he smiled a small, almost shy smile, it felt like the kind of smile that had been waiting a very long time to be given. They didn't speak, not at first. There was no need. Instead, they stood together under the falling snow, two quiet figures in a quiet field, the air between them holding something unspoken but deeply understood. When the wind stirred, bringing with it the scent of pine from the forest, she realized she was no longer cold, not in her hands, not in her chest. The winter air felt like a blanket rather than a barrier, and though they said only a few words before parting that night, those words seemed less important than the spaces between them. Spaces filled with snowlight, soft breathing, and the faint trace of names written in air. In the days that followed, snow became the soft thread connecting their worlds. Each morning, Elin woke to find her window touched with frost again, but now the patterns no longer felt like riddles. They were letters, clear and deliberate, spelling her name in different shapes, sometimes surrounded by curling loops like the edges of old handwriting. She began to answer. On cold nights, she would breathe on the glass, her fingertips tracing words into the fleeting fog before it faded. At first, she wrote only his name carefully, slowly, so that if the frost carried it back to him, he would know she had understood. It became their unspoken ritual. She would write just before bed, and in the morning, a new message would be waiting for her. No full sentences, just names, small symbols, and once a drawing of a snowflake so perfectly formed it looked as though the frost itself had decided to make art. One evening, as the light thinned into that pale blue that belongs only to winter. Dusk, she stepped outside and found him waiting at the edge of the meadow. He was holding a lantern, its warm glow spilling into the snow, casting long shadows between the two of them. They walked together toward the forest, the snow beneath their boots whispering with each step. Branches above them held tufts of snow, dropping them softly whenever the wind moved through Dada as they walked. He told her in his gentle, measured voice that the frost had been writing her name for years. He had never known who she was, only that each winter, his own window filled with the same shapes. At first, he thought it was a trick of the ice, but then, one night, the frost spelled her name so clearly that he began to write back. It had gone on like that for seasons upon seasons, a quiet exchange between strangers, neither knowing if the other could see, yet both unable to stop Dada as she listened. Her steps slowed. The idea that their silent words had been traveling across the cold for so long without meeting in the open air felt almost too tender to touch. They reached a clearing where the snow lay untouched, smooth as the surface of milk. The lantern light glowed softly around them, and in that small pool of warmth, they stood looking at each other while the forest held its breath. There were no grand declarations, no rush of movement, only the steady certainty that they had been speaking to one another for a long, long time in the quietest way possible, and now at last they could see each other's eyes as those words were spoken without sound. The snow began again, fine and delicate, gathering in their hair and on their coats. They didn't move, not yet. It felt as though the whole winter had paused to let them stand there in the space between knowing and saying. The following evenings unfolded like pages turning in a book neither of them wanted to finish. They met often now, though never with haste, always at the edge of the meadow, always letting the snow decide how much of the world to hide. One night the air was so still that their breath hung between them like soft clouds, blending together before fading into the darkness. The moon was low, casting a gentle light across the open field, and the frost on every branch shimmered faintly as if the trees had been brushed with quiet silver. They began to walk, no particular direction, no destination, only following the curve of the meadow as it led them toward the far hill where the snow gathered deepest. The sound of their boots pressing into the soft drifts was the only interruption in the night's stillness. Sometimes they spoke small things, the kind of words that didn't demand an answer, the way the stars seemed closer in the cold. The quiet beauty of a fox's tracks weaving in and out of the trees. Other times they let the silence speak for them, walking so close that their sleeves brushed together now and then, sending small, warm currents through the cold air. At the top of the hill, they stopped. The world spread wide beneath them, a vast expanse of white and shadow, the river below glinting faintly in the moonlight. It felt as though they stood at the center of something infinite, and yet at the same time, the night wrapped around them like a small, safe room. She looked at him, her breath making a soft halo in the air. He met her gaze, and for a moment neither moved. Then, without a word, he took off one glove and reached for her hand. The contact was gentle, warm even in the cold, like the first sip of tea after coming in from the snow. They stood like that. For a long time, fingers resting in fingers, the quiet holding them steady. When the wind picked up, it carried with it a flurry of fine snow, swirling around them in soft spirals before settling again. They began walking back, still hand in hand, their joined warmth leaving no mark in the snow behind them, as if the winter itself wanted to keep their path a secret. By the time they reached the edge of the meadow, the lantern's light had almost faded, and the windows of Ellen's cottage glowed faintly in the distance. They paused there, the unspoken promise between them as steady as the frost that would soon form again on their glass. Winter did not end abruptly in the meadow, it softened, slowly, like a candle burning low. Each day, the sun lingered just a little longer, and the frost on Ellen's window took more time to form, its patterns thinner, its words fading more quickly in the growing light. The mornings became a tender ritual of watching and remembering. She would stand at the window, her fingertips resting lightly on the cool glass, reading whatever the frost had chosen to write in the night. Sometimes it was her name, sometimes a small curve of a heart, sometimes a word she didn't quite understand, but felt in her chest all the same. And always, somewhere out there, he was doing the same. One evening, with the first signs of thaw in the air, they met again in the field. The snow was softer now, carrying the faint scent of earth beneath. Water dripped slowly from the branches overhead, and the light of the setting sun cast the sky in shades of pale rose and gold. They walked without hurry, side by side, listening to the distant sound of melting ice sliding from the roof of her cottage. There was no need to speak of the frost or of how it had brought them here. It was already part of the air between them, woven into each glance, each step, each quiet moment shared. When they reached her window that night, the glass was bare, no frost, no words. Spring was close now, and winter's handwriting would soon vanish entirely. She looked at him, and in that glance they both understood. The frost had simply been the beginning. The words it wrote had brought them together, but their story could now be carried in other ways, in the brush of hands, in the warmth of tea shared by the fire, in the slow walks that would now take place under spring blossoms instead of falling snow. They stood together, watching the last traces of frost dissolve into clear glass. The window no longer needed to speak for them. The silence was enough. As the night settled, the air still cool but gentle now, Elin leaned her forehead lightly against the glass. Beyond it, the meadow stretched quiet and wide, the stars beginning to bloom overhead. She could feel his presence beside her, steady and warm, and it was like resting in the softest corner of the world. And when they finally turned from the window, the faint fog of their breath on the glass lingered for just a moment, catching the starlight like the last line of a story written not in ink, but in warmth. The frost was gone, but the words remained, carried now in every quiet step, every shared smile, and every winter yet to come.